Good afternoon, everyone. Looks like we've had lunch and everybody's sort of like tired or quiet or actually anticipating. But I think we have lots to talk about and we're running behind time, so we'll just carry on. I just wanted to set the scene a little bit about why we're here today. We meet at a time when carbon is now a turning point in terms of converting to capital, and no longer a slogan, but the hard economic reality for African businesses and communities. Across this continent, SMEs are keeping our economies alive and quietly deploying clean technology in local farms, cities, and value chains, yet they sit in a paradox. They create real environmental value, but cannot easily convert that value into affordable and patient growth capital. Meanwhile, the global carbon market is expanding rapidly under Article 6, with trillion-dollar potential by 2030, but Africa's share still remains really small. It is constrained by complex rules, high verification costs, and of course, limited awareness. At the same time, the market faces an integrity crisis. Too many credits have failed to deliver genuine emission reductions, eroding trust and prices, and driving a push for higher standards. The collapse of cocoa networks, for example, once a poster child of Africa's green transition, is a stark reminder of how fragile models become when they rely solely on carbon revenues without strong national alignment and diversified business fundamentals. But the cocoa incident is not an obituary to the carbon market in Africa. It is a warning sign, obviously. It tells us that carbon finance cannot sit on a foundation of weak governance, opaque contracts, and interest in credits. Yet it also shows us what happens when we build impressive infrastructure on top of incomplete public frameworks. I guess Ghana is doing different. The lesson is that the carbon market in Africa is risky. The lesson is that the carbon market is not risky. It is that we need to reimagine our carbon opportunities with integrity, with transparency, and with deals that make sense for everybody. Ghana is obviously choosing a different pathway. Through its carbon market office, as we're going to hear, national authorization frameworks, the National Carbon Registry, Ghana is moving from readiness to real implementation and giving SMEs especially a clearer and more transparent environment under which they can operate. So this panel actually sits on the nexus of risk and opportunity. Our purpose is not to add to the hype, but to answer a very practical and critical question. How can an African SME turn the environmental value they create through carbon credits or emission mitigations into environmental value? How can they create and convert that into a very bankable asset? Rather than just a feel-good story that sits in an environmental brochure on social media talking about the good work that they do. So we'll start by unpacking the regulatory and integrity realities, and then we'll explore the Ghana playbook and how local actors are actually navigating MRVs and Article 6 in practice. So I hope that we succeed today, and if we succeed, every SME in this room is going to leave with a clearer first step, investors with a sharper view of the real risk and viable structures, hopefully, and policymakers in the room, they will leave with the next wave of ideas that would fit the next reform. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, let's begin the conversation. I would try not to introduce the panel because I'll probably get it wrong. I will let them introduce themselves so that they don't have to repeat it again if I get it wrong, right? So I will start with Nabil from the far right.
Thank you, Venan. And good afternoon to you all. My name is Nabil Edumata, Director, Partnerships, Entrepreneurship and Investments at the Ghana Climate Innovation Center. I'm very privileged to be here. Thank you.
So maybe then I go next. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Benjamin. I work for GIZ. I'm managing a project called Make IT in Africa and Catalyst. And Catalyst, in essence, is really a program to support climate tech companies, mainly in the mitigation space. And the way we do that is we run pre-accelerator, we run accelerator, we do TA, but we also invest into companies. And more recently, we also ventured into the because we see that as a big opportunity. And I'm super happy to be here to kick off that conversation as well, because I think it's a very, very important topic. And super interesting to explore that together with you in more detail. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jane Ford Matthews, and I am the co-founder and marketing director of Dyson Energy. So we are a solar energy company in Ghana. We work mainly with commercial businesses, residential homeowners, and some rural electrification projects. We see the carbon markets and carbon credit opportunity as a way for our customers, both businesses and residential, as a way for them to offset the upfront costs of solar.
Hello everyone, my name is Pauline Kerber. I'm the founder and the CEO of She Equity. She Equity is a gender lens fund investing at the intersection of gender and climate. We basically existed to fill a critical gap. We see that gender smart, climate-focused businesses are undercapitalized. So what we have set up is an integrated de-risking mechanism that combines a technical assistance facility, one to address issues around investment readiness, and the second to open up the pathway towards carbon markets, and then a She Equity Climate Fund that invests in early growth businesses that are gender smart, that are solving climate challenges from resilience to adaptation perspective. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Daniel Benefo, and I head the Ghana Carbon Market Office. Our work at the Carbon Market Office is to make carbon market work for everybody. It's a tough call, though. Thank you.
That's a tough call as well. I'll start the first question with you. Given the cocoa, well, just to say, this is a very diverse panel. We have the investor and TA, we have the development finance, we have the entrepreneur, and then we have the regulator as well. It's like you have everybody in one room, right? So I would start with the regulator because they're always the most important people. So given cocoa's collapse, which hinged on the host country authorization decisions, how is Ghana designing its letter of authorization and corresponding adjustment processes? So no, let's keep that one now. We'll come to that one later on. Let's start with the basics. Just explain how Ghana's carbon market is ensuring secure, transparent access to international carbon markets.
All right, so I think we should start from the basis. All right, it's like the way we sell any commodity, right? Timber, just picture timber, salt, cocoa, whatever it is. Every commodity that support the economy. So have a mental picture that carbon credit is a sovereign, intangible national asset, the way we have timber and oil and gold. Just have that mentality, that mindset. It means that for every market, there has to be a buyer, a seller, a system to create the commodity. It can be priced, it can be transferred, it has to be measurable, it has to be real, it could stimulate price discovery. So if I have the asset, I can sell to somebody who is able to buy it for me at the right price. So let's have that mentality that what you are dealing with is an intangible national sovereign asset. The same way we have in Ghana oil, cocoa, and timber. Now, it means that for us to export the cocoa or timber, you should have it, all right? So you should have an inventory that give you a sense of how much you have and what is the market value of how much you have, and of which you can determine how much you can export. So what happened in Kenya was simply about using the national policy instrument to pursue an agenda that will support access to clean energy in the community. That's the first one. Number two, it means that the government of Kenya should have a sense of the inventory of how much carbon assets they have. So the first thing for every regulator is to understand what is the inventory of your carbon assets you have. How much, which sector, what is the quality, how do you generate it, how much you are willing to export, and what are the processes to approve for it transfer. And the purpose of these assets is to enable these investments. Electric cooking, electric bike, solar PVs, because they are deemed to be facing both market and policy barriers or financial barriers. So you can use the revenues from carbon assets to de-risk those barriers. So the essence of a carbon credit is to simply create revenues that can address these barriers to have access to investment. In essence, is to use the intangibles to achieve the tangible. Example of the tangible is riding a good e-bike or having access to clean cooking or having access to clean water, right? That's a tangible. You can use the carbon asset as a means to make it happen. So what happened in Kenya is simply a political risk that was grounded on the perception of the lack of inventory of how much carbon assets the government of Kenya is willing to export on the back of the cocoa project. So it's a matter of two things. It's a matter of the government of Kenya being able to authorize how much carbon cocoa could export to make revenues to support the project on the ground. That process was missing. A clear, transparent, tangible process of approving the amount that cocoa was asking for was missing. That's the first part. So the market was ahead of regulation. Number two was the lack of clarity as to the benefits that there is to the government or the community. In the case of cocoa, we read that the government of Kenya was not clear as to what exactly would be the benefit for the government of Kenya and its people if they are to authorize it. So that presents a very important risk for the project, which is a risk that is institutional and political in nature.
Okay.
i.e., how much can be approved, how much can be transferred, and how much can be retained in terms of value in the country.
So
I hope I made sense.
What you're basically saying is because the market was well ahead of the regulation, the cocoa assets could not be underwritten because there was no clarity in how much assets actually on the carbon registry in Kenya. That's a lot of food for thought. I will park that. We'll come back to some follow-ups, but I'll make sure that each panelist takes a question, and then we'll do a round of follow-ups, and then we have a couple of minutes. I think we're running 10 minutes behind, so we're going to try to shorten the feedback session, but we'll try and do our best to keep it as short as possible. So my next question is to Nabil. So how does carbon finances actually work in practice? And what happens if the carbon process fluctuates, or even if the carbon market crashes?
Right. I missed the opportunity to introduce Ghana Climate Innovation Center, so I'll begin by doing that. Ghana Climate Innovation Center is an institute of the Ashesi University that provides business incubator, business accelerator services. Now, we do business incubation or acceleration through three key mechanisms. One, provide education. Two, provide technical assistance. And three, provide some stimulus, access to finance, usually grant. Now, through what we do, we focus on putting small and medium enterprises that come through our program to the threshold of investor readiness, whilst implementing systems and processes in their firms to avoid CO2 emissions. So you would realize, if you go to our website, that we have an internally generated methodology which we use to quantify CO2 emissions, and the enterprises, some of whom are here, have significantly avoided CO2 emissions. Over the couple of years that we have operated, we have been able to successfully sequester or avoid 4 million metric tons of CO2. But it is not verified, so we cannot trade it. We have only supported them to prove the concept that in their institutions, if the right mechanisms are put in place, they can actually sequester CO2 and actually put them on the market. So that's what we do at GCIC. We supported Share Equity with Pipeline to look at how they can work with enterprises to provide them investment. We still are looking at opportunities. We'll work with enterprises to deepen what they do and to improve their businesses. Having said that, carbon finance actually is the revenue out of carbon credits. Now, what are carbon credits? Carbon credits really are what comes out of an intentionally developed project to either avoid or to mitigate greenhouse gases. Now, to properly access carbon credits, you need to have an intentionally designed project using a methodology from a certified or a certifier that, like Vera or Gold Standard, that can properly show how the CO2 or greenhouse gases are going to be avoided, measured, verified, and reported. Now, once the project is deployed, you would need a third-party verification institution to actually certify through an audit process, a transparent audit process, to ensure that the project actually is fit for purpose and meets the market requirements. And if it's here in Ghana, those market requirements could have been defined by the donor. The market...
Carbon Market Office.
Well, and once the audit process gives a go to the processes being good and certify that what had been sequestered or the carbon that had been avoided is actually good to go, that is when we can say carbon credits are available for sale. Now, it is when you sell this carbon credit, when it's been registered and put into the registry, that you get carbon finance. So like regular financial tools, we can take carbon credits as, say, customer deposits in a bank. And the bank actually gives that out as loans to individuals that come to seek financing. Now, when the credits are sold, that is when you get the revenue, which the bank gets as interest income on these loans as carbon finance. So in brief, and to be extremely simplistic, that is what carbon finance is. Now, the carbon credit actually gets sold to corporates or individual aggregators on the voluntary market, or to institutions that are looking at inserting carbon into their businesses under the Article 6 carbon regulation. These persons actually create demand for the carbon, and it is the projects that actually provide the carbon supplied. Now, volatility on this carbon market essentially is the result of the demand and the supply of the carbon that is being traded. In times where you have, you take the forest landscapes for instance, if you have poor seasons and the forest cover loses their capacity to sequester carbon, then the real supply of the carbon credits reduces, and you may have excess demand over supply. Then you have carbon prices going up. Now, on the other account, when you have more carbon chasing fewer buyers, then you have prices going down. So those are the results of the carbon volatilities. Now, in situations where you have too much carbon chasing very few buyers, you could have the carbon market failing or even crashing entirely. And that way, investors actually lose big time because their money is going there and they don't get anything out of it. Now, remember that the carbon process requires investment to develop the project. And it is that investment that the investors actually lose. The challenge about...
I think you've covered that well. I'll just go to the next panelist. I will come back to you because you're going to be expatiating a little bit on that later on. I would, you've talked a lot about carbon finance and how it works and some of the MRV intricacies. By MRV, we mean monitoring, reporting, and verification, right? That's what MRV stands for, right? My next question is for Jane from Dyson Energy as an entrepreneur. What are the biggest hurdles in setting up a robust MRV system, and what are some of the strategies African SMEs can leverage to implement such systems?
Yeah, so coming from a solar energy company, it's a little bit easier for us to, I suppose, report on this and have a robust system. So if you think that with every solar energy system in place, you're, carbon offsetting or you're displacing your diesel. So it's kind of internationally recognized that that's what's happening. And how we monitor and track that is very simple. There's small meter boxes that we install on every PV solar system. So what we look at, and there's some programs in Ghana right now that we're part of that we're currently working on with both commercial and residential. So essentially we'll look at maybe 3 months of ECG bills, see the energy consumption, see how much carbon tons we're offsetting for those systems. We then insert the meter box on the PV system. That gives us data every 15 minutes, every month, whatever system is needed. It gets stored in a cloud via satellite, via blockchain. These things are very high-tech systems, quite cheap, and we report on them instantly. So from a solar energy point of view, it's quite easily done, and yeah, it's something that's already in place in Ghana through the National Clean Energy Program for solar energy companies.
So what are some of the strategies that SMEs can leverage?
Say that again.
What are some of the strategies that SMEs can leverage to implement such systems?
Yeah, so we're talking about I suppose, carbon financing. Right now, what's available for small businesses or large businesses through the National Clean Energy Program, residential homeowners can access some financing to offset the initial cost, and small businesses as well. So for example, with a lot of the factories and schools and companies that we're working with right now, through the National Clean Energy Programme, they can get about 10% of the upfront cost of their solar back as a cash upfront payment for them. So that's one way to access the carbon markets right now. Obviously there's a lot of theory about other ways, but right now that's the only one available to solar energy and small companies here in Ghana. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, Jane. So, Benjamin, we've heard about some of the strategies that SMEs can use. For solar, it's actually straightforward, right? But let's talk about something like a clean cooking enterprise, for example. How can they prove that their emission reductions are truly high integrity, so that it can command premium carbon prices?
I think there's a couple of things that companies can do. We already talked about the certification, right? So I think in the end, it's all about credible measurement. So it's about making sure that you have strong data that actually prove your impact. And this one can be done if you work with reputable companies that have like standards such as Vera, Golden Standards, etc. But I think what's also important is to understand and see like how can you also bring in that continuous reporting and measurement. You mentioned it, solar is easy, but I would actually argue that even for like clean cooking, there are possibilities. And I think there's a big possibility also in including more kind of like digital measurements. So we have IoT, we have smart sensoring. So even in clean cooking, you actually know, for example, what has been the usage of the clean cooking. You know how much food has been used. So by actually including those, you actually get quite a robust system. And I think that's quite helpful. E-mobility, of course, is another one that really helps. Then you have other industries, which makes it maybe a bit more complicated. If you talk about biochar, for example, I mean, this is hard to have sensors, for example, in all the fields. Including to really have this this real-time data. So I think then it's really much more around the standard certification. But I think if I got your question right, it was also how do you actually justify a little bit that premium, right? And it's also on this important to know that carbon credits, they're not just sold at a single price. Particularly when you go into the volatile carbon markets, companies pay for that. So the question is also how do you make yourself more attractive to companies? And I think an important part that we learned through our programs as well is that you need to have real impact, but you also need to have very strong stories. And while those data, of course, they prove that you're doing positive impact on the climate mitigation, it's also important to think about co-benefits. And co-benefits usually refer to, for example, like, do you also have positive impact on adaptation resilience? Do you have positive impact on community level? Because for a corporate company that actually buys those certificates, I think the biggest risk is around greenwashing. And another thing to understand is like how do they actually use those carbon credits? And one way is that they also have, for example, SDT targets or reporting, which they also look a little bit into the broader picture, right? So while the carbon is really kind of like the centerpiece, if you can add on a few other stories, you can actually get a better price on the market. And last but not least, I think that was quite interesting when you said it's actually it's a very tangible asset. It definitely is, but it's still a very abstract one. If I say like, okay, the company X saved 10 tons of CO2 equivalent, making it even more complicated because it's not only CO2 emission, but you can have other gases, right, in equivalents. What does that mean? So if you have like some co-benefits, then I think you can make that story easier. And maybe the last point, and I think that's maybe a topic we can we discuss it more often, and maybe also curious to hear your point of view. But I think one of the challenges we see that we at the moment have a lot of smaller companies, and selling carbon credits is also a question of volume, right? Particularly when you go into the voluntary carbon markets. And I think there, what we see, which is now developing more and more, are these kind of like aggregators, where not every single company needs to go to this very complicated process that you mentioned, which is also a very costly process and a very timely process. So sometimes it takes up to 3 years to monetize. So the question is like, do we have some kind of aggregators where smaller companies can plug into, bundle basically their carbon credits, but also have access to some kind of TA facility in the carbon market? And I think that's quite an interesting topic as well.
Perfect. So that actually leads us perfectly to Pauline. And there are a lot of green SMEs around, and they would always be told you can actually leverage carbon credits to run your business. But then they will say, my project is actually too small. All right. So what role can impact investors, local system builders, and policymakers play in aggregating small SME projects to lower the high transaction costs, which is always the issue associated with certifying carbon credits?
Yeah, I think Ben answered part of my question. Yeah, so SMEs, just by definition, they're small, but most of the time they have really a big impact. So, and of course, as you said, the transaction cost is one of the barrier, and also actually access to knowledge. Like we've been working with 30 SME gender smart climate-focused SMEs in Ghana for more than a month now. It was actually interesting to realize some of them have heard about the framework that Ghana have set up, but they didn't really know where to begin, right? So that leads me to answer your question around what can all of us do to really unlock access to these carbon markets. One is really intentionally collaborating. Like we put this panel together intentionally, because as we said, we wanted to have everyone sit together and getting to know each other. Hopefully it goes beyond this panel. So from the regulatory perspective, I think you did an amazing job highlighting some of the challenges we have seen with the company Cocoa in Kenya, which was basically being ahead of the market, but at the same time not necessarily fitting in within the existing framework. How do we make sure the SMEs understand where to begin so they're not ahead of the market, or if they're ahead of the market, they understand the implications? So in terms of aggregation, I think as Ben mentioned, you can have independent aggregator like accelerators in some form, but also in Ghana, we have a compliance market in play. Ghana have a signed bilateral treaty under Paris Agreement with a few countries, including Switzerland, where actually corporate in Switzerland can align with what Ghana want to sell to Switzerland, the carbon market. So there, say you have a big role to play to actually look at, based on those bilateral agreements, how can we aggregate a small SME to fit into compliance market? Because unlike voluntary market, compliance market, they don't need to find buyers themselves. If they can plug into a framework that exists, then they access the market. And the issue of being small is no longer an issue. Obviously, the high integrity, the measurement, the proper MRV is important. The other, in terms of the investors, impact investors, I think there was a panel today that was highlighting at the end of the day, we need to remember investors invest to make money. And also impact doesn't happen if investors lose money. That's a fact. So what investor can do is actually, try to access catalytic capital. That's what we're doing. We're collaborating with GIZ to run this TA, where you access catalytic capital that you can put in place to support SMEs to close the knowledge gap, to close the gap around accessing upfront capital to get the expertise you need, and also pay for potential some MRV. And eventually, if the ecosystem works together, you can actually have SME do what they know how to do best, run a business, add more climate impact and scale.
Absolutely. Spreading the risk, educating more people. And so what we're going to do is, I really want the panelists to have another deep dive, but 1 minute each, right? Just kind of say something more so that we would actually have about 7 minutes or 8 minutes of Q&A time, because I don't think I'll be doing justice by letting them go without, for example, asking Dr. Benefo right here to tell us what is Ghana doing to avoid the Kenya scenario in 1 minute.
Okay,
Sorry.
I'll try. But I think I'll rather talk about what we are doing. So where are we with the market in Ghana? We in Ghana had issued the largest Paris-aligned carbon credit in the world, as little as 11,000 tons. Can you imagine that? We have established a carbon registry that allowed us to issue that 11,000 tons globally and in Africa for the first time, and had transferred that. Secondly, on the policy side, we have established the Ghana Carbon Market Framework, the Carbon Market Office. We have a law that covers carbon market in Ghana, and just 2 weeks ago, we finished with the first Ghana carbon market regulation that is with the AGs right now. So we are trying to tidy up the side of the regulation, which deals with institutional arrangement, eligibility, how much we can transfer, how the pricing, tariffs, levies, everything is in that document. The second point is that our pipeline of project had really shot up to our surprise. We had moved from 4 projects to 165 projects in 2 years. And that includes 86% private sector SME projects in Ghana. And it includes what you said, the NCEP is part of our pipeline. So my next point is that what we want to really do is to do one thing, and we think it's important for the rest of the year. We really want to domesticate the carbon market in Ghana by ensuring greater local participation, from benefit sharing to price discovery to name it, to participation. Local banks are far away. 86% of our pipeline is being financed by European pension funds. So we really want to focus on that, and that for us is quite important to make the market work for everybody.
That's interesting. I mean, thinking about the fact that African local private assets in Africa is about $3 trillion, but yet we can't fund carbon projects because probably don't understand what they are. But anyway, thank you, Ben, for making that clarification. Now we understand that you are trying to make it as transparent and predictable for SMEs so that they can actually understand how to participate in the process. Thank you. Nabil, so you talked about the carbon market finance and how it works. So who bears the risk when it collapses, for example? In 1 minute.
Right. The risk primarily hits the investor and the project developers. Now, it does so because the processes that goes through project development is costly, and it affects the volatility and all that. So when the risk comes, the market crashes, it hits the developers, the investors, sometimes to a very small extent the players. Now, let me situate it here in Ghana. There's huge potential in the area of carbon finance here, as SMEs that we've worked with might have seen. The challenge is putting together the parameters and the processes to make good of the carbon that is available. Putting a framework to aggregate what is available is a very good way to go. Now, carbon finance alone shouldn't be the key focus for these SMEs, but looking at a blended financing approach. Now, where you have carbon, let us look at carbon as more like an enabler or an alternative source of financing to the real deal that is being done. Once we blend it, we de-risk the system and we reduce the risk associated with carbon finance.
Thank you, Nabil. And for Jane, please, just under 1 minute, or maybe 1 minute. So what are some of the practical moves that SMEs can actually undertake to build a credible and affordable MRV system?
So I think over the course of the day, we had discussions on 24-hour economy, discussions on how to support SMEs. So I'm going to put the question out there, reflect it a little bit back at you. We've discussed here how to support SMEs, but we haven't discussed the energy infrastructure here in Ghana. One of the biggest costs for SMEs here is energy. There's no grants or incentives to support any of the businesses here in Ghana. We see China being a hub globally of manufacture because their energy is the lowest in the world. So that's something I think we need to look at, and one of the ways we look at that is through carbon for now, until there's better incentives out there. So I think I'm available for the rest of the day if any SMEs want to discuss going solar and how to offset that with carbon. I think when we discuss demanding or those premium prices that we discussed earlier, I think us as Dyson Energy, we have a great story. We are one of the few solar energy companies to mandate gender equality on site. So for every 4 engineers, we have 1 female engineer. And we've piloted the first solar energy program. But it's very difficult for companies like mine to tell that story, right? We're on the field, we're working every day. So coming out and being able to tell those stories is very difficult. I think that the responsibility shouldn't be on SMEs alone. I think that when we look at Africa as a whole and the people of Africa, we produce less than 1 ton per person of carbon. Globally, it's 4.8 tons. So we're way under. Why is it the responsibility of the African SME to figure these things out? And also, just to add to that, why is it we have far lower amounts of the carbon average per ton is about $50. I think it's about $11 per ton we have access to here now, right? Or $35 per ton with the NCEP program. Okay, so what was communicated to us was $35 per ton, which is way below what the average global is. And I would question where if we can have better trade negotiations based on all the great stories from Africa here.
So thanks, Jane. It's like every time the panelists speak, I feel like we need to set up another round of panel session to discuss. Just so much to talk about. But anyway, I will just keep it short. 2 more questions, then we'll go to the plenary questions. Benjamin, so if I'm a Ghanaian company, Ghanaian SMEs, with a good carbon project, how can I actually use future carbon revenue to raise money today?
It's a very good question. I think it's also where the power of the carbon market lies. But before I answer that, and I promise I'm short, just quickly on your point, because I think that's
we have
also
to keep it short.
Yeah, no, I do. I think that's
Please.
also the big realization we had in terms of SMEs. They focus so much on getting the job done, right? That also thinking about, okay, how do I make that good story? What else actually can we sell is very difficult. That's why in our programs, for example, we also include how do you actually create that story, what kind of gender impact, etc. Paradigm shift is a big word on that one, help you basically set up that reporting and that story. I think that has been a learning for us to also include that, even though we focus on mitigation. But now to your question, making it very short, I think there are different mechanisms, of course. One common one is to do offtake agreements. Offtake agreements basically means that you're selling future carbon credits at a fixed price. Usually that's not that easy when you're a small company because you need to have certain volume, you need to have certain traction, but I think it helps in terms of having predictability, it helps in having kind of future revenue streams and predictable revenue streams coming in. Another one that I think we focus a little bit more on, and I think is also now a little bit what we try with the equity, is also what we call carbon-backed financing, looking for investors who can pre-finance, also part of that whole certification process. Because it's costly. I think the key message I just want to place there, because that's kind of from our learnings, is investors also want to know that your business is viable without carbon. So carbon cannot be the main or the sole revenue stream. It's really an additional revenue stream that can also help you grow the business, right? And I think that's super important to know. And maybe the last one is around something similar to what I mentioned before. There are new models coming up. There's also something called carbon as a service, which are kind of like, aggregators or platforms that are usually very specific on e-mobility, on certain standards that help you kind of like tap into their system. So you don't have to register anymore. They do that, they get the revenues, but for example, in your case, then I think that's very interesting when it comes to the different type of blended financing or capital stack. It allows you, for example, to get working capital, and they will be using then basically your future credits to back it up. So I think that's interesting models, or using future sales as collaterals, etc.
Thank you. So the last question to Pauline before we go to the audience for a quick feedback. Tell us a little bit more about the Shea Equity Technical Assistance Facility, and how is that? We've heard that SMEs just want to focus on the job, right? They don't have a lot of time for other kind of stories and packaging it. But tell us a little bit about how your TA can actually help unlock that challenge and make them more accessible to capital market.
So the TA was structured as a de-risking mechanism. One, because we see the potential SME hold for the continent. In Ghana, they face $5 billion funding gap. And then for us, because we are Shea Equity, focused on the gender smart businesses, we were looking also at the gender funding gap that female founders and gender smart business face. So the way we structure it, we're looking at the business case, right? So most of the time you meet a founder, it's a good story, the business sounds really good, but they don't have a data room, they don't have a governance structure, they don't have a financial. You ask them about audit, they don't even have a bookkeeping properly. So what we're trying to do is to basically provide a pathway where a business that is creating value, making money, can actually put structure in place that make them attractive to institutional investors like Shea Equities. So we're doing this because also what we hear often when you talk with other investors, they tell you, we want to invest, but we can't find the pipeline. We actually want to take that excuse away from investors, where we can build a pipeline that's not just for Shea Equity, it's available. And the second thing that we're doing is exactly supporting SME to understand how to get into carbon market, to distinguish a compliance market to a voluntary market, and take advantage of the good work that Ghana has done. Because what we realize, what's missing in terms of carbon market discussion here is really financing SMEs. So that's what we're unlocking to make sure that businesses that should be rewarded for a good work should be able to be rewarded.
Absolutely, thank you very much. Round of applause for the panel, please. And then we would try and take two questions before Kafri comes back. Maybe two questions. Two questions, please. 1, 2. Okay. Maybe we'll do the gender balance. Maybe one question from the gender. Yeah, 3. Okay, so 1, 2, 3. Then we're done. Thank you, sir. Carry on.
Thank you. Could someone maybe broaden this discussion slightly to talk about climate finance versus carbon markets, and how you see the contrasting opportunities for climate finance, perhaps referencing some of the investors who are doing climate finance today, like Acumen or Green Earth or RDF?
The man here would probably answer that question. Dr. Benefo will answer that question. Second question here.
Okay, thank you very much. My concern really has to do with the actual implementers of most of these carbon credit projects, particularly SMEs or largely smallholder farmers. You know, for those of us who are SMEs, we work with a lot of smallholder farmers. And the whole idea of carbon credit is to be able to have an effective monitoring system in place. You know, looking at the monitoring, the verification, and what have you. And that comes at a lot of cost, you know, especially if you want to prove the fact that indeed you are mitigating. And I believe that that is where most of SMEs are at the moment, the ability to scale up and all that. I'm not too sure. I mean, having had all this conversation and discussion, my organization, that's where we are now, we want to scale up because the carbon market is more of numbers game, you know. And so my
you want
question
to scale
really,
up?
yes.
Right. So I would let Pauline address that question in terms of scale up, aggregation and scale up. I think she will be the best person to talk about what she's doing with her technical facility to help unlock
Okay.
that challenge. Oh, were you done with your question yet?
Well, so actually, not really, but
Oh, was there another question coming?
yeah,
Okay, carry on.
yeah. So my question really is, like, what opportunities are there? You know, looking at access to finance for SMEs to be able to easily plug into. Look, because most SMEs are at their growth stage, more or less, but they are looking out for that opportunity to be able to plug into and successfully implement all these requirements as far as the carbon credit market is concerned. And finally, who becomes, should implementers, particularly looking at the African sub-region, there was a question asked, who becomes a price taker and a price giver? I think it's a critical question we need to ask, because if you look at the level of effort, you go out there and then there's a price that is given over there. But if you look at your cost of investment, you are almost running into negative. You get what I mean? We are implementing a similar model, but it doesn't look like the market price out there.
So you seem to have about 3 questions, right? Or is it just 2
Yeah.
questions? So I would go with 2 questions, right?
Right.
The first one about aggregation. The second one, Pauline would take that. The second one about what other financial modalities can SMEs approach.
The price taker, price giver mechanism. Because that question was also asked by one of the panel
I would
members.
let
Yes.
Benjamin answer that. And then
Right,
we'll take
right,
the tech question
right,
and then
right,
we'll
thanks.
go around and
I
quickly.
think I'm
round
done.
up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for this panel. My name is Susan. I'm the Managing Director of CEO Africa, and 2 weeks ago we also launched a debt fund, small pilot, for women-owned SMEs with a climate impact. So very interested in the discussion and speaking to each of you on businesses you might recommend. But also looking at how can we green businesses more. The question I have is twofold. One, with solar panels, for example, how can we green existing companies that are already working? But also you mentioned monetizing these carbon credits. And I've been trying to figure this out as a transaction advisor. How do we add that revenue stream to SMEs that we support? So what is the practical first step for an SME to start monetizing these credits, and where could we refer them to?
Okay, thank you. I think I'll let Nabil take that question. Nabil and Jane will probably, come to me in taking that question. So we'll start with Dr. Benefo here on the first question. You have the mic, right?
Can I contribute to what she said before?
Okay. Yes.
I think that people you should understand the fact that now the carbon markets, as it is right now, the governments have a lot of role to play, a stake. That's why I carefully chose my words. Now, carbon credits are seen as a sovereign, national, intangible instrument, financial instrument. It means that whether it's voluntary market, compliance markets, the government would play a role, not only approving the project, but also approving for it transfer to the end user. It's a very important point I wanted to make, in the sense that that process could affect where to begin from, what approvals you need, how to do price discovery, how to structure your carbon deal. That, for me, is a very important point. The rest, I'm sure they will address it. He also made a point that I think I want to clarify. If the carbon credit projects can in itself be self-sustaining, then there's no point for carbon credits. So for SMEs, make sure that if you intend to use carbon credits to augment or to support your financial or investments, have a clear role for the carbon finance. Otherwise, from our point of view, it's not eligible for carbon credit. That's all I want to clarify. I think the concept of climate finance and carbon finance is already defined by the Paris Agreement. It is defined in Article 9. So Article 9 of the Paris Agreement defines what a climate finance is, and it is simply a financial instrument that supports how to address the additional costs of climate change to development. So you are constructing a road from Accra to Tamale. The cost of the road ordinarily will cost you $10 now, but for impact of climate change on the road is $15. That incremental cost is what climate finance can't pay for. For carbon finance, which is Article 6, it is simply what you said about how to monetize the carbon outcomes of your investment to enable the investment to become commercially worthwhile. Question is, can you monetize the carbon reductions that will occur from climate finance? No. If you can, that becomes an issue of additionality, because those outcomes will happen anyways. However, we have a program with GIZ that is able to blend carbon finance and climate finance. Whereas the carbon finance is investing is providing money for the actual investments, climate finance is used to finance the enabling activities. Therefore, the outcome of a climate finance investment cannot be claimed as a climate finance investment. So that is a very important distinction in blending carbon finance and climate finance on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we'll kind of unpack this in just 2 more minutes. We have to be considerate. Yeah, we're almost done now. Yeah, we're almost done now. Like 2 more minutes, then we are done. So unpacking his question now, Pauline.
I think the part around where to begin, carbon finance, it's very technical. So the starting point will be really to identify an expert in the agriculture value chain and start by putting together an opportunity map, technical term, which is very specific. So this allows you to map out the value chain, because also in your case, when you're working with many small-scale farmers, you need also to define who's going to benefit from this additional carbon money. How much is it going to go actually, benefit the farmer themselves? So those things have to be predefined, and you really need to work with an expert. Right now, that's the situation.
Okay, so maybe Jane, you just carry on and sort of try to round up with his question in mind.
Yeah, I'm going to keep it short. I think there was a
Please.
question from in regards to, and nice to hear that there's more financing and funding for female-led businesses. I think where they can start is, obviously we're here to give advice and leave my contact details. Secondly, there are programs out there for women-led businesses, accessing financing for solar energy projects. So there's an asset program with EcoBank. And then there's, as we discussed earlier, there's the National Clean Energy Program, which is the Swiss government's Click Foundation, offering some financing for your carbon credits. So there is some programs for women-led businesses already, and anything else in terms of solar or energy, they can contact us and we can advise them.
Okay, Benjamin and then Nabil, and then we can round up.
I think the question, if I remember correctly, was around the costing. So that actually the cost is quite expensive, and then you look at the price, and then you actually end up negative, right? So I think there's no easy answer to that, and I think it's also, we are still on an explorative way on that one, but I think it also helps to distinguish a little bit on what we are. So on the one hand, I think it's about how do we drive down or cut down the cost of monitoring, and I think digitalization really helps on that, not for all sectors, but in certain sectors it definitely does. So what we can automate, let's automate, and then I think that can drive costs. The other one, and I think that refers back again to how do we use the carbon credits, or the revenue coming from carbon credits. If this one is really used in a way that helps you scale your business, it's also about the scalability aspect, it actually generates more income moving forward, right? So we've seen cases, for example, where these future revenue streams have been used to lower the prices, make your products more accessible, and by that actually drive growth. And I think if that's used in a very productive way, long term it of course helps. So I think it depends a little bit on the specific case, of course. But I think this is a little bit the case. And then the last one, as I said, is because it's a costly setup to go through the whole registration. We've just seen recently more kind of like carbon as a service companies coming up that actually help you to tap into there. So not every single project needs to be registered, but actually it's just that kind of like aggregator level that is registered, and you just plug in your data. So that again helps you drive down dramatically.
All right, thank you very much, Benjamin. I think we're sort of like, we started really late. I think they're throwing us out now. But please, you can contact the panelists with any further questions you have, and I bet they're going to be able to be of further help to you. So thank you very much. Panelists, thank you very much for being so helpful, and we hope to see you again next year. Thank you very much.